June 22nd, 1941. The forest outside Brest-Litovsk. Lieutenant Heinrich Harpe pressed himself against the splintered bark of a pine tree, breathing hard, trying to understand what he was seeing. The Soviet bunker should have surrendered. Every tactical manual, every training exercise, every campaign from Poland to France had taught him that when you cut off a position, when you surrounded it with superior force, when you made continued resistance pointless, soldiers surrendered. That was how warfare worked. That was the rational response to inevitable defeat. But the men in that bunker kept firing. They'd been encircled for 6 hours. No reinforcements were coming. No supply line existed. The position had no tactical value anymore. The German advance had rolled past them like water around a stone. Yet the machine gun kept hammering out bursts, and when Harpe's men had tried to approach under a white flag, the Soviets had shot the flag-bearer in the chest. Harpe had fought in Poland. He'd seen the Warsaw garrison surrender when the situation became hopeless. He'd fought in France, where entire divisions had laid down their arms once the front collapsed. He understood military logic, the calculus of survival, the point at which continuing to fight became suicide rather than duty. But these Soviet soldiers weren't following those rules. They were following different rules entirely. Rules he didn't understand. The machine gun fired again. Harpe ducked lower, feeling something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden realization that this war might not be like the others. He wasn't alone in that realization. Across the vast front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were having similar moments of confusion in those first days of Operation Barbarossa. They'd been told the Soviet Union would collapse in weeks, that the Red Army was poorly led and demoralized, that one good push would bring the whole rotten structure down. And in many ways, the initial advance seemed to confirm that assessment. German forces were advancing dozens of kilometers per day, encircling entire Soviet armies, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. But something wasn't adding up. The prisoners were surrendering, yes, but only after fighting far longer than made tactical sense. Units that should have retreated were standing and dying. Encircled forces that should have collapsed were continuing to resist, tying down German troops needed for the advance. And even in defeat, even in the chaos of those early encirclements, Soviet soldiers kept doing things that violated every assumption about how defeated armies behaved. Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his diary on the 11th day of the invasion that the enemy's resistance was fanatical. The word choice was revealing. Not fierce, not determined, not courageous, fanatical. As if the Soviet soldiers' behavior couldn't be explained by normal military motivation, as if it required some kind of irrational zealotry to make sense of what German commanders were observing. But from the Soviet perspective, there was nothing irrational about it. They were fighting for their homeland against an enemy whose stated goal was their extermination. They were fighting under a political system that had spent 2 decades drilling into them that surrender was betrayal, that their families would suffer for their cowardice, that death was preferable to capture. And they were fighting with a completely different cultural relationship to sacrifice than their German opponents could comprehend. Obergefreiter Benno Ziese, advancing through Ukraine that summer, tried to describe it in a letter home. "They don't fight like the Poles or the French," he wrote. "When we surround them, they don't surrender. They fight until they're killed. Every village, every field, every meter costs blood. I don't understand what drives them." He paused, then added a line that would prove prophetic. "I'm beginning to think we don't understand this enemy at all." The confusion deepened as German forces pushed deeper into Soviet territory. They encountered tactics that seemed to violate the fundamental principles of warfare as they'd been taught. Soviet units would allow themselves to be bypassed, then attack German supply lines from the rear. Soldiers dressed as civilians would open fire from buildings in supposedly secured towns. Groups of Red Army soldiers, cut off from their units, would melt into the forests rather than surrender, then wage guerrilla warfare against German rear areas. This was partisan warfare, and the German army had no effective doctrine for dealing with it. They'd been trained to fight other armies, to engage in the clean geometry of fronts and flanks, advances and retreats. The idea that the war would continue in areas they'd already conquered, that enemy soldiers would refuse to accept defeat even when their military position was hopeless, fundamentally challenged their understanding of how war worked. Gottlob Biedermann, fighting with the 67th Infantry Regiment, described encountering a group of Soviet soldiers who'd been cut off for 3 weeks. They were out of food, low on ammunition, had no hope of relief. When German forces finally located them in a forest bunker, they expected surrender. Instead, the Soviets fought until the last man was killed. Biedermann helped clear the position afterward. Inside, he found the bodies of 12 men, along with empty cartridge casings, birch bark they'd been eating, and a red banner still hanging on the wall. "Why didn't they surrender?" one of Biedermann's comrades asked, staring at the corpses. "They must have known it was over." Biedermann had no answer, but he was starting to understand that knowing it was over meant something different to Soviet soldiers than it did to Germans. The German military tradition emphasized tactical flexibility, the intelligent adaptation to circumstances, the acceptance of temporary defeat to preserve force for future operations. The Soviet system emphasized something else entirely. Resistance, regardless of circumstances, ideological commitment over tactical calculation, the political meaning of surrender versus death. The German army had prepared for many things. It hadn't prepared for an enemy who would rather die than quit. As summer turned to autumn, another dimension of confusion emerged. The weather grew cold, then colder, then brutally, impossibly cold. German soldiers had been told the campaign would be over before winter. They had summer uniforms, no cold weather gear, vehicles and weapons not winterized for extreme temperatures. They'd conquered most of European Russia, stood at the gates of Moscow, but they were utterly unprepared for what came next. The Soviet winter offensive of 1941–42 introduced German soldiers to an enemy they understood even less than the ideologically motivated infantry they'd been fighting all summer. These were Siberian divisions, men from the Far East who'd grown up in cold that made the Russian winter seem mild. They wore white camouflage that made them invisible against the snow. They moved on skis, appearing suddenly out of blizzards, attacking and vanishing before German forces could respond. They seemed immune to cold that was killing Germans by the thousands. Lieutenant Heinrich Harpe, the same officer who'd been confused by Soviet resistance at Brest-Litovsk 6 months earlier, now found himself even more bewildered outside Moscow. He watched from a frosted window as white-clad figures materialized from the snow, overran a German position, and disappeared back into the storm. "They're like ghosts," he wrote. "We can't see them, can't hear them, can't fight them. Our men are freezing to death in their positions, and the Russians move through the snow like it's summer." The temperature had dropped to 40 degrees below zero. German weapons froze and wouldn't fire. Vehicle engines seized. Men lost fingers and toes to frostbite, then hands and feet. The wounded froze to death before they could be evacuated. And through it all, Soviet forces kept attacking, kept moving, kept fighting as if the cold didn't exist. It wasn't that the cold didn't affect Soviet soldiers. It did. They suffered from frostbite. They froze to death. They struggled with the same brutal conditions, but they were equipped for it. Trained for it, psychologically prepared for it. They had winter uniforms, felt boots, white camouflage. Their weapons were designed to function in extreme cold. Their vehicles had winterization. And perhaps most importantly, they knew how to fight in winter, how to use the weather as a weapon, how to move and survive in conditions that paralyzed their enemy. For German soldiers, this was another fundamental assumption shattered. They'd been taught that their training was superior, their equipment was better, Their tactical doctrine was more advanced, and in many ways those things were true. But none of it mattered when they couldn't pull a trigger because their fingers were frozen, couldn't advance because their vehicles wouldn't start, couldn't see the enemy because he was wearing white in a white landscape. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Army, wrote in his memoir about the winter of 41–42. The Russian had proved himself superior to our men in his ability to cope with the cold and with the terrain. Coming from one of the architects of Blitzkrieg, one of the most successful German commanders of the war, this admission was remarkable. The Germans weren't being outfought by superior tactics or strategy. They were being defeated by an enemy who understood the environment better, who could function in conditions that rendered German advantages meaningless. But the Eastern Front wasn't the only place where German soldiers encountered enemies they didn't understand. In other theaters, different kinds of confusion emerged, rooted not in tactics or climate, but in culture and psychology. North Africa, 1942. Hauptmann Wolfgang Everth, serving with the Afrika Korps, was briefing his men before an attack on a British position. Intelligence reported that Indian troops, specifically Gurkhas, were holding the sector they'd be assaulting. One of his veteran sergeants, a man who'd fought in France and Russia, interrupted the briefing. "Sir, about the Gurkhas, we should wait for daylight." Everth frowned. "We're attacking at 0400. That's the plan." "Sir, the Gurkhas, they do night raids. They're good at it. Better than good. If we're in their sector at night, before we attack—" The sergeant trailed off, but his expression said everything. Everth had heard stories about Gurkhas, mostly from Italian allies who'd faced them in East Africa. Small men from Nepal, fighting for the British Empire, carrying curved knives called kukris. The stories had seemed like exaggerations, the kind of mythology that grows around any effective enemy unit. But the fear in his sergeant's eyes was real. They attacked at dawn instead. And when they overran the position, Everth understood why his sergeant had been afraid. The Gurkha defensive positions were expertly camouflaged, sighted for interlocking fields of fire, prepared with a professionalism that impressed even German officers. But it was the personal effects they found that unsettled him. The kukris, razor-sharp and clearly well used. The ropes and grappling hooks for silent infiltration. The blackened faces and hands of dead Gurkhas, prepared for night operations. These weren't soldiers who fought the way Europeans fought. They'd adapted jungle warfare techniques to the desert, combined British military organization with their own mountain warriors, traditions, and created something German tactical doctrine had no framework for understanding. The British knew this, of course. They'd been using Gurkha troops for over a century, had learned to integrate their unique capabilities into conventional operations. But for Germans encountering them for the first time, the Gurkhas represented something outside their experience. Not just good soldiers, but soldiers who fought according to different cultural principles, who brought different assumptions about combat, who used silence and darkness and cold steel in ways that violated European conventions of warfare. The psychological effect was disproportionate to the Gurkhas' actual numbers. German and Italian soldiers spread stories about the kukri knife, about sentries found dead without a sound, about Gurkhas infiltrating positions and killing sleeping men. Some of these stories were true. Many were exaggerated. But the cumulative effect was to create an enemy who seemed almost supernatural, who couldn't be understood or predicted using normal military logic. An Italian officer fighting alongside German forces in North Africa tried to explain it to a German counterpart. They don't fight for territory or politics. They fight because fighting is what they do. It's their tradition, their identity. You can't negotiate with that. You can't demoralize it. You can only kill them, and they're very hard to kill. Italy, 1943. The confusion reached new heights when German forces encountered another colonial unit that operated according to rules they couldn't comprehend. The French Expeditionary Corps included Moroccan Goumiers, Berber tribesmen from the Atlas Mountains, and they fought in ways that horrified even veteran German soldiers. Oberst Wilhelm Maus, commanding a defensive sector in the mountains south of Rome, received his first report of Goumier activity with disbelief. An entire German outpost, 12 men, had been wiped out during the night. No shots had been heard. No alarm had been raised. The men had simply been found dead at dawn, killed silently with knives, their weapons taken, their position occupied by French colonial troops who'd appeared from nowhere. "How did they get past our sentries?" Maus demanded. "Sir, the sentries were the first killed. We think the Goumiers climbed the cliff face. It's nearly vertical. We didn't think it needed to be guarded." Maus studied the map. The cliff was over 200 meters high. Loose rock, no established route. "They climbed that, at night? In silence?" "Yes, sir. And they're doing it all along the line, every night. We can't predict where they'll hit. We can't hear them coming. By the time we know they're there, they're already in our positions." The Goumiers were mountain warriors, tribesmen who'd grown up in terrain even more rugged than the Italian Apennines. They could move silently over ground that German soldiers found impassable. They could climb cliffs in darkness. They navigated by stars and terrain features, needed no maps or compasses, and they fought with knives and bare hands as readily as with rifles, comfortable with close combat in a way that shocked German soldiers trained in the firepower-intensive warfare of the 20th century. But it was more than just their tactical capabilities that confused and frightened German forces. The Goumiers came from a completely different cultural context, with different concepts of warfare, different moral frameworks, different relationships to violence. They took few prisoners, they mutilated enemy dead, they committed atrocities against civilians that horrified even their French commanders. German soldiers, encountering the aftermath of Goumier attacks, found themselves facing an enemy who seemed to operate outside any recognizable rules of warfare. A German lieutenant, captured by American forces in Italy, spoke about the Goumiers during interrogation. The American intelligence officer's report noted, "Subject expressed more fear of Moroccan colonial troops than of any other Allied forces. Stated his men would rather face an American armored division than a company of Goumiers at night." When asked why, Subject became agitated and refused to elaborate. What the lieutenant didn't say, what many German soldiers struggled to articulate, was that the Goumiers represented a complete breakdown of the conceptual framework through which they understood warfare. War was supposed to have rules, conventions, mutual understandings even between enemies. Prisoners were taken. Civilians were distinguished from combatants. Combat had boundaries, limits, predictable patterns. The Goumiers seemed to recognize none of these conventions, and German soldiers had no idea how to fight an enemy who didn't share their basic assumptions about what war was. This cultural confusion extended beyond specific enemy units to broader encounters with Allied forces whose behavior didn't match German expectations. American soldiers, in particular, confused German commanders and troops alike, but for completely different reasons than Soviet or colonial forces. Normandy, June 1944. Hauptmann Ernst Schröder, commanding a company of the 12th SS Panzer Division, was analyzing American tactics after several days of combat. What puzzled him wasn't American ferocity or unusual methods. It was their informality, their apparent lack of discipline, the way they seemed to fight without the rigid structure German doctrine considered essential. "They don't follow their officers," he told his battalion commander. "I mean, they do, but not the way we do. The officers lead, but the men make their own decisions. They break formation, take initiative, adapt without orders. It's chaos, but somehow it works." The German army was built on hierarchy, on clear chains of command, on orders flowing from top to bottom and being executed precisely. Initiative was valued, but within strict parameters. Soldiers were trained to think, but also to obey, to maintain unit cohesion, to operate as part of a larger machine. The American approach seemed to violate all of this, yet American units were effective, often devastatingly so. Part of the confusion stemmed from material abundance. German soldiers were accustomed to scarcity, to making do with limited resources, to carefully husbanding ammunition and fuel. American forces seemed to have unlimited everything. They called in artillery barrages that would have consumed a German division's daily allocation of shells. They abandoned damaged vehicles rather than repair them. They ate food from cans that German soldiers found astonishing in its variety and quality. A German prisoner captured in France was given a K ration by his American captors. He examined the contents with disbelief: canned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, sugar, toilet paper, even a can opener. "This is for one soldier? For one meal?" he asked. When told yes, he laughed bitterly. "We were told America was weak, that you couldn't sustain a war, but you feed your soldiers better than our officers eat." The material abundance revealed something deeper that German commanders struggled to understand. The American way of war was fundamentally different from the German approach. Where Germans emphasized tactical excellence and operational art to overcome material limitations, Americans emphasized material superiority and individual initiative to overwhelm enemy advantages in training and doctrine. Neither approach was inherently superior, but they were based on such different assumptions that each side found the other's methods almost incomprehensible. But perhaps the most profound confusion came not from tactics or resources, but from ideology. German soldiers had been told they were fighting subhumans, that their enemies were racially inferior, that German victory was inevitable because of their inherent superiority. Then they encountered the reality: Soviet soldiers who fought with a determination that matched or exceeded German motivation. Colonial troops whose martial traditions were older and deeper than Germany's. American soldiers whose industrial society produced warriors as capable as any in the world. At every turn, the racial ideology that was supposed to explain and justify the war collided with evidence that contradicted it. Some German soldiers rejected this evidence, clung to their ideology despite what they experienced. Others began to question, to wonder if they'd been lied to recognize that their enemies were neither inferior nor incomprehensible, just different. And a few, very few, began to understand that the confusion they felt wasn't because their enemies were mysterious or irrational. It was because their own assumptions were wrong. Lieutenant Heinrich Harpe, who'd been confused by Soviet resistance at Brest-Litovsk in June 1941, survived the war and wrote a memoir years later. In it, he reflected on those early encounters. "We thought we didn't understand the Russians because they were Asiatic, because they were communists, because they were different from us, but that wasn't it. We didn't understand them because we'd convinced ourselves they were less than human, and you can't understand what you've decided isn't worth understanding. The confusion wasn't theirs, it was ours." By 1944, as the war turned decisively against Germany, the confusion had evolved into something darker: recognition. German soldiers were encountering enemies they'd once dismissed as inferior, and those enemies were winning. The tactical confusion of the early war had given way to strategic reality. The Wehrmacht was being ground down by Soviet mass and determination in the East, overwhelmed by American material superiority in the West, outfought by British and Commonwealth forces in Italy, defeated by enemies they'd been told they would easily conquer. The confusion had never really been about understanding enemy tactics or capabilities. Those could be studied, analyzed, adapted to. The deeper confusion was ideological and psychological. How do you process the fact that enemies you've been taught to despise are defeating you? How do you reconcile the propaganda you've believed with the reality you're experiencing? How do you maintain faith in your cause when every assumption underpinning that cause is being disproven in blood? Some German soldiers never processed this. They fought to the end, believing in ultimate victory, or at least in the righteousness of their cause. Others became cynical, fighting only for survival or for the men beside them, and some few underwent genuine transformations, recognizing that the confusion they'd felt wasn't a failure to understand their enemies, but a failure to question their own beliefs. The partisan war in the Soviet Union continued to the end, with German forces never developing an effective counter-strategy. The tactics that had seemed so incomprehensible in 1941 remained incomprehensible in 1945, not because they were inherently mysterious, but because the German military framework couldn't accommodate warfare that wasn't about controlling territory or destroying armies. Partisan warfare was about will, about making occupation impossible, about fighting not to win battles, but to make victory meaningless. The Germans never understood it because understanding it would have required abandoning fundamental assumptions about what war was for. The winter warfare that had shocked German forces in 1941 continued to give Soviet forces advantages throughout the war. German soldiers learned to cope better, received winter equipment, adapted their tactics, but they never achieved parity with Soviet forces in winter operations. The environmental understanding, the cultural adaptation to extreme cold, the psychological comfort with fighting in conditions that seemed inhuman, these couldn't be taught or issued. They had to be lived, and German soldiers from temperate Europe never fully internalized them. The colonial troops, Gurkhas and Goumiers and Senegalese and all the others, remained objects of fear and misunderstanding. German commanders learned to respect their capabilities, to prepare for their tactics, but never to truly comprehend the cultural contexts that produced such warriors. How could they? The German military tradition, for all its excellence, was rooted in European concepts of warfare, in clear distinctions between soldier and civilian, in conventions about acceptable violence. Colonial troops brought different traditions, different boundaries, different relationships to combat. The confusion was inevitable, and American forces, with their material abundance and informal discipline and individual initiative, remained puzzling to German commanders even as they learned to fight them effectively. The two militaries were products of such different societies, built on such different assumptions about hierarchy and authority and the relationship between individual and institution, that mutual comprehension was perhaps impossible. They could study each other, adapt to each other, kill each other with great efficiency. But truly understanding each other required bridging cultural gaps that went far beyond military doctrine. In the end, the confusion German soldiers felt when facing enemies they didn't understand was less about the enemies themselves than about the limits of their own understanding. They'd been taught that warfare was a science, that superior training and doctrine and will would prevail, that their enemies were inferior and their victory inevitable. Every assumption proved wrong. Not because their enemies were incomprehensible, but because the Germans had never really tried to comprehend them. The Soviet soldier fighting to the death in an encircled bunker wasn't irrational. He was operating under different incentives, different fears, different concepts of honor and duty. The Siberian ski trooper appearing from a blizzard wasn't supernatural. He was simply better adapted to his environment than the German soldiers freezing in summer uniforms. The Gurkha infiltrating positions at night wasn't mysterious. He was applying mountain warfare skills to a different terrain. The Goumier scaling an impossible cliff wasn't violating the laws of nature. He was using capabilities developed over generations in the Atlas Mountains. The American soldier taking initiative without orders wasn't undisciplined. He was operating in a military culture that valued different things than the German system did. None of these enemies were incomprehensible. They were just different. And the German military, for all its tactical excellence and operational sophistication, had built itself on the assumption that different meant inferior. When that assumption collided with reality, confusion was inevitable. Not because the enemies were confusing, but because the Germans had confused ideology with understanding. The testimonies German soldiers left behind, in letters and diaries and memoirs and interrogation reports, document this confusion in painful detail. They describe encounters that didn't match expectations, tactics that violated assumptions, enemies who refused to behave as predicted. But running through all these accounts is a common thread: the struggle to reconcile what they'd been taught with what they were experiencing, the difficulty of admitting that their understanding was incomplete, the challenge of recognizing that confusion might be a problem with the observer rather than the observed. Some learned, many didn't, but all of them at some point faced an enemy they didn't understand and had to decide whether the failure of understanding was theirs or their enemy's. That choice, more than any tactical or strategic decision, shaped their experience of the war and their ability to make sense of what they'd lived through. The ones who chose to question their own assumptions, who recognized that different didn't mean incomprehensible, who learned to see their enemies as human beings operating under different but equally valid frameworks. Those soldiers gained something valuable even in defeat. The ones who clung to their confusion, who insisted their enemies were irrational or inferior or mysterious, learned nothing and understood less. The war ended with Germany's total defeat. The enemies they hadn't understood had won. And in the decades after, as German veterans wrote their memoirs and gave their testimonies and tried to make sense of what they'd experienced, the confusion remained for many of them. They'd fought enemies they never understood, lost a war they'd been certain they'd win, and were left trying to reconcile the vast gap between what they'd believed and what had actually happened. Some managed it, others never did. But all of them carried the memory of that confusion, of facing enemies who didn't fit their categories, who violated their assumptions, who won despite being dismissed as inferior. That confusion, perhaps, was the most honest thing about their experience, the moment when ideology cracked and reality came through. They just didn't know what to do with it.